People born into cults who left. What was your oh crap moment? There wasn't really one concrete oh crap moment, but the first time I remember thinking, this is BS, was how often people would be sentenced to hell for the most trivial reasons. Everything from an impure thought to cursing to sleeping in late. So one day I was discussing future marriage with my mother, as all 11-year-olds in the sect do, and the topic of what would I do if my husband potentially abused me came up, having witnessed frequent mistreatment and power play relationships by that point. Me. Then divorce is okay, right? Her. No, divorce is never okay. But what if he beat me really, really bad and I was hurt with bruises? It's still not okay. Well, then what do I do? You pray for him and ask the Lord to help him see the error of his ways. The Lord can always work, and it's blasphemy to try to interfere with his plans by divorcing. That's when I remember thinking, BS. Story 2. My brother and I grew up in a cult family. Not specifically naming anything, but has since disbanded to my knowledge. Though some of y'all might know which town this happened in. Picture this, a rural town, middle of nowhere, only a handful of people. It was made very clear that outsiders weren't welcome, and we obviously didn't get many guests. The ones that stumbled upon it were lost. The town looked creepy as hell, so they cleared out fast. Contact to the rest of the world was non-existent. We didn't have access to anything. No news, TV, etc. Here are some of the worst things that are burned into my memory. Live animal sacrifices were common. On special occasions, leaders cut them open and followers were required to eat a piece of the heart. One time I threw up after the ceremony and was beaten. People got sick frequently but weren't permitted to see a medical professional outside of the cult. But the doctors in the cult were absolute quacks. Education was handled by leaders and whoever they appointed. My older brother really liked dragonflies and other insects. Our dad would capture them and force him to pluck the wings off as a sacrifice. It was typical for the members to be banging each other, consensual or not. Leaders and their favorites were allowed to assault people. My brother and I knew our real parents, but we were taught to treat every adult as a parent. They turned a blind eye to the abuse of children. They would marry us teens/kids off informally to people within the cult. When I say informally, I mean no government or legal work to back it up. We were just told we would be marrying this person and didn't have a choice. I had a romantic and semi-intimate relationship with a teenage boy in the cult. I was younger than him at the time. I became overly paranoid because it was against our religion to be engaging in same-sex relations. For a long time, I thought I was going to die since he disappeared one day with a no warning. I still don't know what happened. If he got out by ditching in the middle of the night like I did, or if someone got him first. Edit for clarification. I don't know what happened to my parents, but they're probably dead. I haven't seen my brother since that day, and I have no way of contacting him if he's alive. And I don't even know where he'd be. I did enlist in the army, and the recruiter who got me in, the friend previously mentioned, worked his butt off with helping me get legal documentation. I gave him all the personal information I knew, we reached out to hospitals in the state, and eventually a document with my last name and parents popped up. I was fortunate enough to be in a state that only needed a statement that said you were that person in order to get a birth certificate. The recruiter also helped me obtain a student ID so I could get the other documentation I needed, social security card, etc. Note, it wasn't an immediate transition from cult to military, though I understand why some of you may think that. Story 3. When I was 19 and by the orders of my pastor, my mom took my bedroom door off the hinges. They were doing everything in their power for me to not leave the church. She would do random searches and pat-downs to see if I had any communication to the outside world. There were so many signs that I started to see when I got older. I was raised in the religion, but I was terrified to leave due to the shunning, the fear, and being ashamed of leaving the truth. Also, my mom didn't want me to go to a therapist even after knowing I was having panic attacks, because she was afraid that the therapist would take the fear of God out of my life. Ah yes, a sign of a good and secure faith. One that you can't question, and one that you can't even contact the outside world in. Very good. Very healthy. Story 4. One of my best friends today was raised in a freaky Afro-Islamic cult. He and his mom left when his dad was sent on a mission to Sudan. As it turned out, he was sent to fight in a civil war on behalf of the local tribe/cult, and they never heard from him ever again. They assumed he was downed. He described his childhood as animal sacrifices, usually goats, every Friday, and he was forced to eat the heart raw and to drink the blood else he would be beaten. The cult owned a house-turned-apartment building in Detroit where he lived, and said that his mother was never permitted to leave the building. He described how female genital mutilation was mandatory for all girls, which is especially screwed up. Crazy to think of these kinds of things happening in the US. When he was 8, he and his mom managed to escape the cult by stealing thousands of dollars in cash and fled in the middle of the night. They paid a truck driver to smuggle them into Canada. They stayed in the country illegally for a month, slowly making their way from Ontario to British Columbia, where they smuggled themselves back across the border into Washington. There they got support from a mosque who set his mom up with a place to live and a job at a restaurant, and helped my friend get back into the school system and back into society. For years they were paranoid as hell, because they thought the cult was going to hunt them down and end them. But being dressed head to toe in a burqa has its advantages, I guess. She was able to hustle at the job, and through financial support from the mosque, he was able to attend college where we met. He's working at a bank now and doing really well for himself. He's getting married soon, and he's fully supporting his mother as well. Story 8. It was a Sunday. Sundays we would usually go during the day and afternoon, but after the first part when my parents sat me down, they told me we were leaving. I recall being sad because I was playing a game with my friends. At the time, I was confused. My friends that I grew up with ignored me like I didn't exist. I felt like everything I knew was gone. Later on, I slowly pieced together that what went on there wasn't normal. I noticed the manipulative tactics, like showing us graphic videos of people dying and being ripped up because they didn't follow God. They told us that if we didn't ask the pastor for permission in relationships, we'd end up being abused. They made us have no TV to isolate us, but there's more. But it was very difficult leaving. It felt like my entire life was a lie, and everything I had learned for 12 years was taken away, and I was left clueless as ever. I couldn't relate to anyone. Story 6. When I was at a yearly conference at a megachurch in my state when I was 15, there were fog machines and laser lights during worship, and the power mysteriously went out as we took communion, which was an obvious indication that God was in our favor instead of just an overloaded circuit or someone pulling the plug. That's around the time I realized you can trick anyone into believing anything and started doing research. Officially denounced the church when I was 17 and had seen enough. Story 7. I don't think I ever truly believed, but the moment that was cemented for me was when I had the unfortunate experience of going on a mission trip to Cambodia. Long story short, 2 teams from the church I previously attended were sent. For the first 2 weeks, the teams were sent to different locations. During this time, we helped the local communities, and it was actually pretty nice. Normal prayer sessions, etc., etc. However, during the last couple days of the trip, both teams met up and stayed in the same location. It was then that stories from the other team about being possessed by the devil, spiritual enlightenment, tongues becoming a vessel for God to speak through, and being struck down by the love of God were mentioned by the other team. Keep in mind, till that point, our team just had our good old regular fashion prayer sessions. Surprise, surprise. Later that night, when both teams held a joint prayer session, members from my team started hysterically yelling, crying out for God, passing out on the ground. And it was at that moment I realized it was all BS and pretty much mass hysteria mixed with an enlightenment dong measuring contest. An enlightenment dong measuring contest is a great descriptor. Nah, dude, I love God more. He's speaking through me. It's crazy, bro. Turns out people like feeling the best at literally anything, even religion. Or cultism? I don't know how to word that. Moving on. Story 8. My mother and I had a conversation about how cute babies are, and she mentioned that the sweet, innocent, lovable nature of infants makes a mother forget the nearly lethal experience of the labor. She kissed my cheek and called me Angel. I asked her why then I was born if my elder brother's birth was so terrifying and painful for her. Deuteronomy 5:16 roughly says that children who honor their father and mother as God says, therefore honoring God too, will be blessed. And the parents are therefore blessed by having a respectful child. In the cult, job descriptions and qualifications include scriptures. My father wanted a job, and one of the requirements was that his children respect him and fear the Lord. But he only had one child at the time. He was told he wouldn't get the promotion unless he had a second child. And my mother was accosted several times, being told she was selfish, a hellish woman, worse than Eve, that her kitty was a hole to hell. That's not an exaggeration. It was a common insult in the cult, along with calling others uncircumcised and haughty, because people in cults speak with marked peculiarity. She had several panic attacks and finally stuck off to find a psychiatrist and renew her use of the anxiety medication she was on before my father made her stop. Once I was conceived, my father was promoted and they were transferred to what was at the time the USSR. My brother was left with, honestly, I don't know who, and my parents won't tell me, but they left for the remainder of her pregnancy. Against medical advice, they flew back to the US and I was born in Illinois. For the next 5 years, we were left with strangers who ranked highly enough in the cult to take care of the children of my father's ranking, until we were assigned secondary parents. Give about 13 years and I had a secret and god-awful boyfriend who did not understand consent, but then again, neither did I. Well, one day I walked home and after a rough date, and upon going to the bathroom, I found blood. I realized it was nowhere near time for my period. I told my mother and she said that's what happens with men, and went to her room. The next Friday, I felt so disgusted that I wanted to purge myself, die to myself, and give my life to the cult. so I confessed everything about how impure I was to the female leaders. She told me I know nothing of pain, and because of my father's ranking, I lie for attention. The other said she would not trust me to hold her own child, which is a very insulting thing to tell any female who is menstruated, as this is your primary function in the cult, to care for your own and other children. It's worse than telling someone their very existence is inherently meaningless. The third said my presence was detrimental to the souls of those around me, so I am to leave and not return. And since I'm a liar, if anyone fully in the cult asked me what happened, they told me to lie, or they will say I'm a harlot and a liar. I missed the next 3 periods until one day I was sitting in our living room in an expensive house in Southern California paid for by the forced tithe of those who could barely feed their own children, and I started to bleed a lot, and then vomit. And then I could barely crawl, so I laid in the bathroom until it was over. I thought I was gonna die and, well, I was happy about it. I woke up in the bathroom, cleaned up, and went to school. My secondary sister snuck me pain meds from the medicine cabinet. Father is prone to migraines. I told my parents what happened that Thursday. My mother started crying, but my father stopped her. She said that right after she had my brother, she conceived again, twins, but she lost them, bled them out like a curse. My father told her that she had ended the wrong child and they left me to process it. I didn't have any tears or anger, just sort of a sharp clarity that since hadn't left me. They later told me they were proud of me because I didn't cry, but needed time to process the death of the wrong daughter. In case you want more reading, International Church of Christ, ICC/COC/ICOC, there are plenty of articles and documentaries. Story 9. I grew up in a church that was one compound and a bulk order of Kool-Aid away from being a cult. They mostly focused on the end times and how much and when to tithe. For me, there were 2. The first, when the preacher preached a sermon on how God doesn't care about how good or evil you are, only if you believed the correct things. So yeah, you could be a baby murdering cannibal, and so long as you believed what the church did, and only what the church did, you're going to heaven. The second was when he preached a sermon about how babies, children, and yes, even the mentally disabled, go to hell. Unless, of course, they believed in the correct way. Of course, as he put it, most of them were in hell. The idea that God is all-knowing and all-loving and tortures babies and the mentally handicapped for eternity was abhorrent to me. Now, from what I know about theological debate, the idea of where do babies and stuff go is a hotly debated topic, even within faith communities. But never have I heard, at least, of the idea that, oh, they just all go to hell. Usually there's some like, well, they're inherently good or something. No, these babies, they're all in hell. What? That's, honestly, I kind of respect it in a way. I'm like, you took a stance. That is an absolutely nuts position, but it's a position for sure. Story 10. I grew up in a crazy Baptist church. What started my doubt was the fact I waited months and months to get baptized, but it never happened because they were always too busy for baptism classes. They pushed this fact, you had to be baptized, but it's no big deal to push it off. What if I die tomorrow? Then one day came when I had to rush to a youth meeting after softball practice. They handed out the fundraiser chocolates, and I had to bring them with me into the meeting, so I slid them under my chair. The pastor's wife called me a heretic and accused me of some Bible story where Jesus came in and found people making a market in the church. She said some stuff like I should be stoned to death. Then she dragged in the fact my mom sold Avon and gave ladies in the church their orders after services. I never went to church again. Story 11. Like others, my experience maybe wouldn't be categorized as a true cult, but the whole think like the herd and don't question God's plan really made me feel like it. It's a fairly mainstream religion, but so robotic and hypocritical, I still consider it a screwed up way to be. The things that started it for me was a teacher at the private school run by the church insisting rather cruelly that my pets can't go to heaven because they have no souls. I was 6 and it felt like it was just a heartless thing to say. Also, the sexism. This was reflected in the dress code policy. The whole idea that girls carry the responsibility to be wholesome and not tempting in any way by wearing long skirts, no sleeveless shirts, etc. Also, the teachers saying mean and hurtful things to students. Body shaming before it was ever called that, a thin-built girl for being too skinny, making fun of the poor kids for being less well-kept than the other students, bad-mouthing students publicly, humiliating corporal punishment. I have no idea where the religious message of Jesus is love fit in there because I sure didn't hear it much. Only the abuse from the pious staff. Edit. They spouted a lot of, soon you'll be required to take the mark of the beast, an implant in your hand or forehead, but you must resist and be willing to die for the church. I only recently found out that the whole mark of the beast thing was based on a totally hypothetical fictional, film from the 70s some pastor made, who later said it was a work of fiction. But by then it was already too late and many fundamentalist church groups took it and ran with it. Story 12. I always imagine a cult as people wearing dark robes and chanting around an altar for something a little sinister. So I'm not sure what really qualifies as a cult, but this might. Qualifiers right now. I'm a Methodist, which is a pretty low-key Christian denomination. I've never been to a church with a priest, always a preacher. I dated a girl a while ago whose family were longtime members of what one might label a very fundamentalist Christian sect. As far as I know, the only members of this group are in this one city in Texas, where we both lived at the time, and it's a very Christian city with a little bit of history with extremist Christian groups. Her stepfather was normally pretty curt to her mother whenever I saw them together, and according to her, he was pretty verbally abusive to her when others weren't around. Her group's priest, when she went to him for some counseling on leaving him, told her to just love him and suffer through it because that's what their scripture said. Their whole group was pretty heavily in on the women remain subservient to men in all scenarios. Now, for the definitively culty things. Their scripture was the Bible, but cherry-picked to get rid of some things, and with a few extra books added that their priest had stuck in because he had visions that told him to do so. The members needed permission from the priest to leave the church, and they had to do a period of counseling with him before even looking into a separation, much less an actual divorce. They had a few homes where college-aged kids in the church could live together while going to the local university. The students who were around when I was in school weren't bad people as far as I could tell, just a little hipstery. They did have mandated worship and prayer time every single morning. My girlfriend lived there for a year before we dated, because the rent was super low, and she later said they really freaked her out. Story 17. Not me, but a friend of mine lived in a Bruderhof community in the UK. It's not technically a cult, but it's very cult-like, and they basically live like most cults. After leaving it, he told me about many oh crap moments, like discovering basketball, computerized music, video games, etc. My favorite was when he told me about discovering cartoons. He had no idea that it was possible to make drawings move. For him, seeing a cartoon for the first time at 17 was like a drug trip. Story 14. Was part of one for 20 plus years. We had a serious no-contact rule. We always thought the ones who left got kicked out for doing something wrong, because the ministry manipulated us into believing that, when in reality they were against the no-contact rule and just left. We were not allowed to have any contact whatsoever with people who had left the church/cult, even if it was your own family. We were also told to not have any spiritual conversations with them, to just keep it short and physical. At least that was the rule before eventually they changed it to the point where you can't even live in the same house as them, whether it be your spouse, kids, parents, etc. That really ruined and broke up a lot of families and relationships. My mom, grandma, and more of my family left, and they wanted to split us up and send me away somewhere else to live, despite the fact I was the only child in that family household and was working to support them. Yeah, screw that crap. I was out of there in no time. Story 15. I was born into a radical Pentecostal church during the early 80s and 90s when exorcisms were a thing. They would perform these during church and home groups on Sunday nights. It was always interesting to watch because the people would go all out, talking in a different demon voice, ushers needing to hold them down and convulsing on the floor. It was Sunday night and I was at our youth pastor's house for home group. I was 14. After the singing and praise, the youth pastor started his speech. There's someone here who's been backsliding away from God. They've changed and seem to have blah blah blah. I remember thinking, ooh, who's it gonna be today? And that's when I heard my name called, along with, can you please come to the middle? Definitely took me off guard, but like a good sheep I went. Everyone gathered around me, started putting hands on me, and speaking in tongues. Then the youth pastor placed one hand on my back and the other on my stomach, as it started to kick off, getting louder and louder. That's when the youth pastor started to give me the Heimlich, basically getting his hand all up under my ribcage. It hurt and only got worse. I was thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to get out of this? So I faked being slain in the Holy Spirit and fell to the ground. I stayed still and everyone backed off and continued praising the Lord. After what felt like an eternity, I was grabbed by the arms and they moved me to a different room. I waited a bit longer and finally got up and left. I haven't been to church since. I'm 39 now. What do they expect to happen here? Genuinely. Like, even if we're thinking from a completely manipulative, we don't believe any of this, but we're trying to control people's standpoint, what is the end goal? How would this not make more people leave? The only explanation I can think of is they truly did straight up believe that they were exercising OP? Weird. I guess. I always thought these kinds of things were mostly done under some sort of feeling of like, oh, well, it's not like really real, but we do. I don't know, actually. It's just weird to hear about this, I guess. Freaky stuff, man. Story 16. I didn't grow up in a cult, but I did grow up cult adjacent. My parents were long-term missionaries, meaning they did it all the time, not like 6-month or even 2-year stints. And they were part of a missionary team. There were 3 other families on their missionary team. 2 were culty and 1 was normal. I mean, normal for someone who's dedicating their lives and their children's lives in part to living in a foreign country to indoctrinate the natives, but it's all relative. The first time I clearly remember thinking, people be crazy, was when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. The mom of one of the crazy families was teaching Sunday school. Sunday school that day consisted of the mom, me, my sister, and maybe another boy. She was lecturing us about secular music versus godly music, except it wasn't about the lyrics, it was about the actual music. Not like rock music or drums are bad. No, that would have been like, well, that's disappointing, but okay. Instead, she was going on and on about how songs that didn't definitively end, I guess songs that faded out, would get stuck in your head, and you'd repeat them over and over without meaning, which was bad because, chanting, I think? Like, chanting was of the devil and spells used chanting, and the devil would control your mind that way. And then there was a whole thing about a certain number of beats being sinful. But as I was very young, tone-deaf, and literally don't even like music, I just fully zoned out at this point and just smiled and nodded at the appropriate points. But I distinctly remember thinking, she's insane. Just well and truly nuts. I was pretty concerned about her level of crazy because I told my dad about it. And he was like, oh, don't worry about it, you don't have to believe that. Which of course leads to the thought, well, if I don't have to believe that, what else don't I have to believe? Turns out, the lot of it, when you grow up to be a heathen. Story 17. I grew up like this. Here's some points that even as a young child under 10 made me question religion. 1. Couldn't say things like dang, darn, crud because they meant damn and crap and I was hurting God or something by damning him. 2. Women must be subservient to men. I've always been an extremely independent woman and this bothered me. I also hated my dad and disagreed with his whole ideology on multiple levels, so being subservient to him was the last thing I would have done. 3. Attending a public school was a surefire ticket to hell. The homeschooled kids had no idea how to socialize, question authority, form their own opinions, or research, and that concerned me. 4. Not just no banging before marriage, but no dates without parental supervision and no hand-holding and no kissing. I had worldly half-brothers who preached taking a test drive before committing. That made too much sense to me at a very young age. 5. The Bible was 100% historically fact and not just the legends or whatever to teach morals and values, and that bothered me. 6. Women were the reason humanity had sunk so far into depravity. Eve lured Adam from the Garden of Eden, and then women were cursed with periods and the pain of childbirth. Also, women were temptresses and must cover themselves at all time or they would lure men from the path of God. 7. Flip-flops were the devil's sandals. I'm pretty sure God wore thongs in the Bible, but whatever. 8. Modern hairstyles were the devil's doing. 9. Women who were beaten by their husbands were expected to pray their husband's anger away and not divorce. Divorce under any circumstance is a one-way ticket to hell. 10. Interracial marriages were strictly frowned upon and just short of forbidden. I loved everyone equally and regularly hung out with kids from all different cultures. I hated this rule. After all, God said to love your neighbors. I left the church when I was 11. I went to live with my older brother because my father was abusive. I've not attended church regularly since. I ended up in an interracial marriage with biracial babies. I recently saw one of the daughters of the pastor and she surprisingly is somewhat even-keeled, but I suppose that is more on her husband's part than her family's. She was flabbergasted by how proud I was of my life and how happy I am. She was told I was on the streets doing drugs and selling myself. My mom left the church and, for the most part, my father. They're still married, but live in separate states. It took years for us to repair our relationship, but we worked through it. My motto as a child attending the cult-adjacent church was, people be crazy. Story 18. My family broke off from the main LDS church in the 60s or 70s because it wasn't conservative enough for them. I don't know if I'd fully categorize it as a cult, but it was bad. Really, really bad. Most Mormons I know now and have talked to about it are flabbergasted. They cherry-picked rules and ideas from a bunch of various conservative movements, but most of our religious ideology was based around Mormonism. I knew I had to get out when Matthew Shepard got murdered, and my parents considered his murderers to be doing the Lord's work. As a very young boy who already knew he was gay, it was a rude awakening that they considered murderers in the right over a gay guy who hadn't done anything wrong. I waited until college somehow. I managed to convince my parents to let me go to a secular school states away. I came out and was told I needed to quit school and come home for an ex-gay program or be kicked out of the family. And I chose the latter. I haven't spoken to any of my family in years outside of an uncle who escaped as well, except once. When my sister called to inform me my mother had died and then asked for money to help pay for a funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. I told her I wouldn't do it unless me and my fiancé could go, and she hung up on me. I do creep on my cousin's Facebook, though. She married a guy who is a normal Mormon, apparently, and is now allowed to use the internet. Except for her, every member of my family I've seen in pictures looks absolutely miserable. Yep, as a gay person, that would do it. That is a pretty good way to be like, maybe this whole religion, cult, whatever, not for me. Especially when it seems like it's sort of an offshoot of Mormonism that's like hyper conservative. Doesn't seem like the best place for someone like OP. And it also seems like he realized that. The gall of the sister, though, to ask for money for the funeral he couldn't go to. Oh, I would be so mad. I bet his sister didn't even, like, do a whole catching up thing with him. I bet there wasn't even the guise of, like, oh, how are you doing or whatever. It was just straight up, Mom is dead, we need money. Anyway, OP, I'm glad you made it out. And to everyone else here, it seems like at the very least you're all much happier, and that's really what matters. For now, though, that is all the stories we have. I hope you have a wonderful day or a night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.